Hello, I know I'm bashing out a lot of videos today, but I was like, when I was had the cold, I did a lot of reading, and I was like, I'm very hay feverish, so I just kind of stayed indoors with the light on and read as best I could, and listened to stuff and thought about things, and a lot of kind of memories come back when you're not feeling well. And one of the things I want to talk about is my experience with a Magdalene laundry. I was actually in one, believe it or not, as a kid. Now, if you don't know what the Magdalene laundries are, what they were places where a young woman could be sent who had a child out of wedlock. Often she had been raped by a family member in a rural area, or fell in love with someone, a student, and got pregnant back in old Ireland in the olden days. I think about the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and very early 60s it all ended. But or even she could be sent away for just being pretty. Her ignorant parents would listen to the nuns telling them that your daughter's in danger of becoming a fallen woman, and she's too pretty to be in normal society. So they would put them in these places called Magdalene laundries. Now, what the Magdalene laundries were they were most of them were laundries, but some of them did things like baking and other things like that. But the majority were these women who committed no crime could spend either a period of time or the rest of their lives washing bed linens. It became a very lucrative business for the Irish Catholic Church. On one hand, they were able to get contracts to wash bed linens for all the hotels and hospitals, and that was wrong on one level because they were using slave labor. These women, they were destroying business because legitimate companies, legitimate laundry firms, and contractors could not bid on these contracts with the Magnon laundries because they'd have to pay their staff a salary to wash laundry and deliver it and everything, while the Magdalene laundries would have these women as slaves. And so it was a and the nuns too. A lot of the nuns would have been, victims of abuse themselves. Would have had a massive income from this. Also, if these girls were pregnant, assuming they didn't have a mixed race child, which was very common in Ireland, particularly in Dublin, where girls from the country would come and fall in love with an exotic African student and they'd have a baby. While if the mixed race child would probably be put into a children's home like that monstrous thing down in Tuam, uh, and a nice blonde-haired, blue-eyed, or red-haired, hazel-eyed Colleen or little Irish boy could be sold as an illegal adoption to Irish American couples who'd want a little Irish baby. And so it was lucrative on that end. They made a lot of money, and they got government money. They got all kind of grants from the Irish government, and this went on for a long time. And there was horrific abuses, a lot of sexual abuse by lesbian nuns who would have been the precursor of the sort of psychopathic lesbian social worker. In Ireland, they would have been the psychopathic lesbian nun back then. And also by Catholic male priests who coming in and forcing themselves sexually on these vulnerable women. It was a holocaust. It was just sick. And anyway, when I was about 13, I was always a very industrious kid. I was always like working pocket money jobs and delivering papers. I was always looking for work. I had an uncle who used to be like a handyman. He used to do like what we call in Ireland nixers, jobs of like fixing things or building things, and all tax free in his pocket cash. And I used to go around with him now and again, and he'd pay me. And I always used to spend Saturdays with him, and he was a bit of fun, and he had really good tools. It was the first time I saw like a handheld angle grinder, and he had really good I learned a lot about working with tools with him, and I made some money, which was great for when you're 13. You can buy comics and records and stuff. And one of the jobs we did one Saturday was a Magdalene laundry. I didn't know what it was at the time. I found out later, but it was a large Victorian building in South Dublin, in one of those suburbs like Dundrum or Donnybrook. I don't know which one. It was one of those old suburbs on the south side. It was either Dundrum or Donnybrook, and they had a delivery van, and there was a guy there who worked for the laundry. He was like a civilian, who delivered the laundry to the hotels and stuff that they washed. And my uncle got the job of building a partition between the driver's cab of a Fiat van and I think it was a Fiat or a Renault van and the main area, so it kept separate. And because laundry things, towels and bed linen was falling on him, so my uncle had got in there. We went in there and we put angle metal, around the outside. And he was a genius carpenter. He got like in one cut, he cut the plywood perfectly and just instantly put it in, bolted it, riveted it to the bottom. And that's what we did all day, and that was great fun. I was using the angle grinder at 13, the small one, and so while I was working on the van with my uncle, all during the day, these middle-aged women kept coming out and grabbing me cheeks and playing in my hair and going, "Oh, isn't he gorgeous? Isn't he lovely? Look at his lovely hair." And my uncle was smirking and saying, "I knew you would get that here today." And he goes, "These are all women who don't have children." That was all he said to me at the time. But they were all like, "God, isn't he lovely? Oh, go on here." And all day long, like we had the nuns gave us, and the nuns in the Magdalene gave us lunch, and all day long the women were coming down from the laundries going, "Do you want some ice cream? We have some cake," And it wasn't until years and years later and I can have such strong memories of that day. It was a dull winter. It wasn't cold. It was a dull winter day in South Dublin. But I have such strong memories of that experience, even though it was so long ago, and everyone except me involved in it is probably dead now. But I can remember how the women were all fawning over me. And it wasn't until years later when I discovered what Magdalene laundries were. That the laundries in terms of were closed by then in terms of locking women up. What was happening was they were these are women who would have been brought in there in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, very latest, and 50s and 40s, and they'd grown old there, and so they were the last of them. So they were not there so much being punished; they had nowhere else to go. This is the sadness of it. Their parents had died off and they couldn't go back home, things like that. So the nuns and priests would take care of them and they would still do laundry and stuff like that when they still had contracts. But wasn't until years later that I realized that these women were treating me as a surrogate child, because that's how sad it is. They were replacing me with the child that they had taken from them when they went in there pregnant. So you hear a lot of horror stories about the Magdalene laundries, and you hear a lot of, quite rightly, the human rights abuses, but you don't really hear stories like this of just how, on a fundamental human decency level, how sad it was that I was 13 or 14 and I spent all day being pampered by these middle-aged women, uh, bringing me down cake and ice cream all days long because I was the grown up baby that they had taken away from them. The Magdalene laundries. Never let that story die. Very sad.